Imagine a local police force, right? They spend, let's say, 500 hours a year rigorously preparing for an active shooter.
Which, sounds like exactly what they should be doing.
Right, it sounds great. They run the drills, they check all the little boxes, and they feel incredibly confident. But what if I told you that all 500 hours of that specific training might actually cause those exact officers to freeze up and fail when a real attack happens?
It sounds completely counterintuitive. I mean, almost absurd on its face.
Yeah, it really does. But today, we are pulling back the curtain on that exact terrifying reality. Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a highly urgent topic today based on an article published literally today, March 12, 2026.
Yeah, the piece comes from Tech, and if you aren't familiar, they are a major tactical training company. It's written by an author named Herfel, who brings a very specific, heavy perspective to this whole issue.
Oh, absolutely. We are talking about a veteran firearms instructor. He's got a 30-year career spanning law enforcement and tactical education. So he's been on the ground, and right now he is sounding a massive alarm.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to decode exactly what he's warning us about. We are looking at this massive gap between what he calls training theater and actual real-world operational readiness in law enforcement.
Specifically when it comes to these coordinated hybrid attacks.
Right. To put this in perspective for you, imagine you spent months studying for a very predictable, perfectly formatted multiple-choice test. You memorize the answers, you know exactly which number 2 pencil bubble to fill in.
You're totally ready for it.
Exactly. But then, on the day of the exam, you aren't handed a test paper. You are locked inside a complex, high-stakes escape room.
Yeah, the walls are moving, the lights are cutting out, water is rushing in, and the rules of the game change like every 10 seconds. That multiple-choice prep you did, it's not just useless in the escape room, it actually makes you slower to react because you just keep looking for a piece of paper that isn't there.
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just some insider critique of police tactics. This directly impacts you. I mean, this is about understanding how the security of the public spaces you frequent is actually managed.
Like the stadiums or outdoor festivals, transit hubs, that kind of thing.
Exactly, all those places behind the scenes. And to really grasp why this matters today, we have to place this in our current reality. So, the Department of Homeland Security issued a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin back on June 22, 2025.
Right, I remember reading that.
Yeah, and it stated very clearly that the United States is operating in a heightened threat environment.
Reading through the sources for this, that heightened environment isn't just one isolated issue, is it? It's tied to this whole web of overlapping factors.
It really is. The DHS bulletin explicitly cited concerns tied to the Israel-Iran conflict, a notable increase in complex cyber threats, and the potential for violence inspired by current, highly polarizing events.
And just to be clear, we are purely reporting what the federal guidance states here. We aren't taking any sides on those underlying political issues.
Right, absolutely. But the operational takeaway for law enforcement is undeniable. The baseline temperature for potential threats has been significantly elevated since last year.
Which should have been a massive wake-up call, right? Forcing serious agencies to immediately rethink their security postures.
It should have been, yes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because logically, if the threat level goes up across the board, you'd think the training at the local level would automatically adapt to match it.
You would think so.
But the Tech article makes this devastating critique. It argues that many agencies are confusing mere awareness with actual readiness.
Right. They read a federal bulletin, print it out, put it in a binder on a shelf, and they literally call themselves prepared.
But I have to play devil's advocate for a second here. Even if the training is super basic, isn't any training better than no training at all? Like, why is a clean training scenario, say, a basic active shooter drill in an empty school hallway, actually considered dangerous by this author?
Well, it's a very natural assumption to make. You think, oh, walking through the basics builds a good foundation. But the author argues that practicing a simplified reality builds a highly dangerous false confidence.
So it creates a rigid mental map.
Exactly. Let's look at what unserious agencies do. They rely on weak tabletop exercises. So literally sitting around a folding table talking about what they would do in an emergency.
Or relying on generic checklists.
Yeah. And when they do run physical drills, they train for one suspect at one single scene, operating on one clear radio channel with a perfectly clean timeline.
Right, it's the multiple choice test. The suspect appears, the officers engage, the threat is neutralized, and everyone goes home.
But real coordinated attacks do not arrive cleanly. They just don't. They are specifically engineered to overwhelm weak systems. A real-world incident doesn't start and end in a single hallway.
Is much messier.
Way messier. It might begin with the vehicle ramming into a dense crowd, and as first responders rush in to help the victims of that vehicle attack, that's when the firearms are introduced.
Oh, wow. So they wait for the police to arrive.
Exactly. Then, as backup arrives, explosive devices detonate. Attackers use diversionary tactics on the totally opposite side of town just to pull police resources away from the primary target.
So you have massive crowd panic, secondary crime scenes, and attackers probably coordinating digitally in real time.
Yes. So if an officer's brain has only ever been wired to respond to that clean, single suspect timeline,
What happens when they step into that chaos?
the system utterly breaks down in the first 2 minutes. I mean, if officers are only trained to walk down a predictable, simplified path, they face absolute cognitive paralysis when the event changes shape in real time.
Because their brain just has no mental map for it.
None. A vehicle attack that morphs into a bombing, that morphs into a shootout while their radios are screaming with conflicting information. They just freeze. The training theater becomes a huge liability.
Because the command staff assumes their people can handle a complex attack, simply because they successfully completed a simple drill.
Exactly.
Man, if that multiple choice training is actually paralyzing officers in the real world, it means we can't afford to wait until the attack starts to figure out our response.
No, we absolutely can't.
The old way of running drills is a dangerous illusion, so the focus has to shift entirely. How do agencies actually detect these complex threats before they explode into chaos?
That requires a complete shift in operational mindset. The author stresses that law enforcement and, frankly, the public needs to stop chasing Hollywood stereotypes.
Right, the cinematic expectation. So what does this all mean? It sounds like we need to stop waiting for the villain to monologue and announce their evil plan, and start watching who is buying the blueprints to the bank.
I love that analogy. Let's ground that in a slightly more practical one.
Yeah.
Think about a casino pit boss watching a blackjack table.
Okay, yeah.
The pit boss isn't looking for someone who looks like a cartoon bank robber, right? And they aren't waiting for a player to announce they are counting cards.
Watching behaviors.
Exactly. Very specific physical behaviors. How the player holds their chips, how their betting pattern shifts in relation to the deck, where their eyes are darting. They are looking for the behavioral preparation cycle of a cheat.
So it's entirely about the mechanics of what they are doing, not who they are.
Exactly. And the federal intelligence community takes the exact same approach to public safety. The text references the 2025 Violent Extremism Mobilization Indicators.
Those were put out by the FBI, the DHS, and the NCTC, right?
Yeah, the National Counterterrorism Center, which is the federal hub responsible for connecting the dots across all these different intelligence agencies. And these guidelines don't tell local cops to look for caricatures or wait for a published manifesto on social media. They tell them to look for contextual behavior that signals a movement toward violence.
So if we aren't looking for a manifesto, what are the actual behaviors on that list? Like, what does the preparation cycle for a hybrid attack actually look like?
Well, the federal indicators highlight several key pre-attack behaviors. First is target surveillance.
Meaning what? Just staring at a building?
Not just glancing at a building. It's someone deliberately testing the security at a venue, mapping out camera blind spots, or physically clocking the response time of security guards.
Oh, that makes sense.
Then you have suspicious travel patterns that just don't align with logical, personal, or business needs. Concealment tactics to hide their communications.
What about physical items?
The clearest physical indicators are attempts to acquire weapons or the chemical precursors needed to build explosives. And finally, researching tactical responses.
Meaning they're studying how police react to an incident so they can plan around it.
Exactly, or making efforts to gain sensitive, unauthorized access to a facility.
Okay, this sounds incredibly proactive, which is great. But here is the massive red flag that comes up for me, and I'm sure you listening might be wondering the exact same thing.
What's that?
If we are asking local police and venue security to constantly look for suspicious behavior, how does an agency rebuild this kind of public vigilance without it just devolving into toxic profiling or community paranoia?
It's a critical concern, and honestly, it's the exact trap that lazy, unfocused messaging falls into.
Yeah.
Lazy security messaging creates noise, public mistrust, and a flood of useless reporting based on bias.
Right. which helps no one.
Exactly. But the federal guidance and the Valortech author are incredibly clear on distinguishing between bias and behavior. Protected characteristics, someone's race, religion, or background in lawful conduct in isolation are fundamentally not enough to constitute a threat.
Meaning, you can't just report someone because they look a certain way or because they are legally taking a photograph of a bridge in a public place.
The key word there is context. It's about training people in lawful documentation and behavior-based reporting. Let's go back to the casino pit boss. Taking a photo isn't illegal.
Right.
But if someone is testing a locked maintenance door at a municipal power plant while attempting to conceal their face from the cameras, and intelligence later shows they recently tried to purchase restricted chemical precursors.
That is a behavioral pattern.
Yes. The article states very firmly, the absence of a manifesto does not mean the absence of a threat. It's about recognizing that preparation cycle through highly disciplined, lawful intelligence work that focuses on actions, not identities.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because the author doesn't just leave this behavior detection strategy as some abstract theory.
No, he backs it up.
Yeah, to prove that this readiness gap exists right now, the article walks through a terrifying timeline of very real, very recent case studies. The sheer variety and complexity of these threats completely dismantle the idea that a simple active shooter drill is enough.
They really do. Let's examine how the timeline escalates. It begins on January 1st, 2025, with the Bourbon Street attack in New Orleans.
And according to the FBI, this wasn't a standard incident. The attacker deliberately drove a pickup truck into a crowded area.
Right.
Then, after the initial chaos, he exited the vehicle and began firing on the law enforcement officers who were responding to the crash. Investigators later found evidence of extensive pre-attack planning.
Look at the mechanism there. It's a layered assault model. The truck pulls focus and creates a mass casualty event that draws first responders in.
And then the ambush.
Exactly. The firearm is then used to ambush those responders. That tactic instantly shatters the one suspect, one weapon, one scene training scenario. If the officers arriving only know how to handle a traffic collision, they are walking straight into a trap.
And the complexity of the planning just gets darker.
Yeah.
In June 2025, the Department of Justice announced the extradition of Mohammed Shazeb Khan.
Yeah, this was a major one.
Yeah. This was in connection with an alleged ISIS-inspired plot targeting a Jewish center in Brooklyn. But what really jumped out at me in the source material was the method. He allegedly discussed creating a real offline cell to carry out a coordinated assault. How does an offline cell even work in 2025?
Well, an offline cell is deliberately designed to exploit the blind spots of modern intelligence. We're so used to federal agencies sweeping up digital chatter, intercepting encrypted messages, or monitoring radical forums.
You think everything is online?
Right. But an offline cell cuts the cord. It relies on face-to-face communication, physical drop-offs, and analog planning specifically to evade that digital dragnet. They operate entirely in the shadows until the exact moment they strike.
Wow.
For an intelligence community built around intercepting text messages, an offline cell is incredibly difficult to detect unless someone notices those physical, real-world behavioral indicators we discussed earlier.
Which proves exactly why that local behavioral vigilance is so necessary. And the timeline doesn't stop there. Just a month later, in July 2025, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York announced charges against a Manhattan man.
He was accused of manufacturing multiple improvised explosive devices.
IEDs, intended for use right there in Manhattan.
And that brings us right up to the present day. On March 9th, 2026, just 3 days before this Valortech article was published, the DOJ announced charges against 2 alleged ISIS supporters.
The accusation. They were attempting to detonate explosive devices in a protest crowd outside Gracie Mansion in New York.
Which is just terrifying.
Think about the variety we just covered here. We are talking about trucks used as battering rams followed by ambushes, highly coordinated invisible offline cells, IEDs being constructed in city apartments, and attempts to bomb a densely packed political protest.
It's a lot to take in.
Anyone in police leadership who pretends that these hybrid layered attacks are just too rare to bother planning for is, frankly, being totally negligent.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author's point is that these incidents aren't statistical outliers anymore. They are the new operational baseline.
They're the standard now.
Exactly. They are exactly the kind of overlapping multi-vector violence that shatters fragile training theater. The Bourbon Street attack, the Gracie Mansion plot, these real-world cases brutally expose weak command assumptions.
Meaning if they can't pivot, they fail.
Yes. If an agency's command structure cannot function when an event rapidly changes from a peaceful protest to a bombing or from a vehicle ramming incident to an active shootout, then they simply are not prepared to protect the public. These cases prove the absolute need for immediate systemic change at the local level.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. How do we actually fix this?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. I- If the threat environment is this complex and the current multiple-choice training is dangerously inadequate, what is the blueprint for moving from this illusion of awareness into actual on-the-ground action? The article lays out some very hard truths for police chiefs, sheriffs, and command staff.
It really demands a complete top-to-bottom overhaul of their operational capability. First, they must completely change how they train. They have to run realistic, scenario-based training for layered attacks.
But wait, how do you even simulate that realistically without someone getting hurt? Like physically hurt in the drill?
You introduce compounding stress factors safely. You run a drill that starts with a simulated vehicle attack, and while the officers are triaging those victims, you trigger a simulated explosive device down the block.
To force them to split focus.
Exactly, but most importantly, you simulate communications overload. In every major disaster, radio networks get jammed because everyone is trying to talk at once.
Oh sure, the network just crashes.
Right. So training has to force officers to practice managing casualties and making life or death decisions while their radios are failing and the intelligence is still updating under immense pressure. Because, as the author notes, real incidents violently punish simplification.
The second fix is about who is actually doing the detecting. The article argues it can't just be the federal counterterrorism analysts locked in a secure room somewhere in Washington.
No, local agencies need behavior-based detection across their entire ecosystem.
And that means training the people who are actually interacting with the public.
The patrol officers on the street, the 911 dispatchers answering the frantic calls, the school resource officers walking the halls, and the private hospital security partners.
Everyone has to be on the same page.
Yes. A dispatcher needs to know how to listen to a caller describing a strange vehicle parked near a stadium, recognize it as a fragment of mobilization, document it lawfully, and push that information up the chain immediately.
The third piece is hardening soft targets. For anyone listening, a soft target is basically any public gathering space that is easily accessible and lacks intense security.
So parades, festivals, open-air markets.
Right. They are attractive to attackers because they offer easy access and high symbolic impact.
And this is where CISA comes in. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Right, usually cyber stuff.
Yeah, while they handle cyber threats, they also provide extensive guidance on physical security for critical infrastructure and public gatherings. Hardening a soft target requires deep planning long before the crowd arrives.
It's not just setting up some cones.
No, it means integrating unified command. So the police, the fire department, and the private event security are all operating from the exact same playbook. It involves strict route control, erecting physical barriers to stop vehicle rammings, and establishing very clear suspicious activity reporting pathways for the event staff.
And finally, they have to fix intelligence sharing before the crisis hits. The author was absolutely brutal on this point.
He did not hold back.
No. He pointed out that agencies love to hold press conferences and talk about interagency partnership after an attack happens. But serious leaders build those communication channels beforehand.
That's where the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs, come into play.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, a JTTF is essentially a federal hub where local police officers, state troopers, and FBI agents literally sit at the same desks to share raw intelligence and investigate threats together.
Oh, so they're in the same room.
Yes. Alongside local fusion centers, fire rescue, EMS, and venue security, these networks need clear, immediate communication pathways. If your intelligence sharing only works after the ambulances have already arrived, it was never effective to begin with.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this blueprint, though. It's very easy to say, just run multi-site, force-on-force drills with simulated explosions and integrate with federal intelligence databases.
Yeah.
But we're talking about local, often drastically underfunded police departments. A 50-person department in a mid-sized town does not have $1 million sitting around to run Hollywood-level simulations or harden every soft target in their city.
That's a very fair point.
How on earth are they supposed to pay for this without bankrupting the municipality? Getting federal grant money is a bureaucratic nightmare. Is the money actually reaching the ground?
It's a very common and usually very valid objection. but the text definitively counters it in this specific context. The funding actually exists, and it's mandated.
Wait, really?
Yeah. FEMA's Homeland Security Grant Program recognized this exact gap. They instituted a requirement that at least 35% of its funding must be directed specifically to law enforcement terrorism prevention activities.
That's a huge chunk.
It is. That was the rule in fiscal year 2024, and they maintained that exact same 35% mandate in the fiscal year 2025 guidance.
Wait, so the federal money is explicitly carved out and sitting right there for these local departments to use on this exact type of training.
It is. The expert insight from the author is that when agency leaders claim they simply can't afford realistic training, they are very often deflecting.
Wow.
The hard truth, according to this 30-year veteran, is that many agencies do not have a money problem. They have a standards problem.
Oh, that is a heavy accusation.
But true. It is much easier and requires far less effort from leadership to just sign a policy update, put a bulletin in a binder, and call it a day, rather than navigate the grant process, demand aggressive system testing, and refuse to confuse paperwork with actual operational capability.
That is a staggering realization. The barrier isn't always resources. It's often the willingness to do the hard, uncomfortable work of true preparation.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Velatech article, the core message you need to take away is this. Reading a threat bulletin is not readiness. Holding a binder full of plans does not stop a coordinated, layered attack.
It absolutely doesn't.
True preparedness is a rigorous operational capability. It is built through incredibly high standards, realistic force-on-force training that pushes responders to their breaking point, and a hyper-focus on pre-attack behavior rather than Hollywood buzzwords.
Spot on.
And for you, listening to this, understanding this landscape, makes you a much more informed, aware citizen. When you go to a marathon, a concert, or a major public gathering, you now know the difference between the illusion of security, that training theater, and the actual hidden mechanisms required to keep a crowd safe in a complex threat environment.
This raises an important question, and it's something I want to leave you to mull over. We've talked a lot about police chiefs, federal intelligence, and tactical teams. But the text points out a fascinating reality.
What's that?
Fragments of suspicious behavior, someone surveilling a loading dock, someone testing the security boundaries of an arena, are very rarely first encountered by a federal agent. They are almost always first seen by local 911 dispatchers, school resource officers, venue security, or even everyday event staff.
So the local everyday awareness is actually the very first line of disruption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if the very first line of defense against a highly coordinated, devastating offline sleeper cell isn't necessarily a heavily armed federal tactical agent, but rather a vigilant ticket taker, an observant dispatcher, or a local hospital security guard.
It totally flips the script.
It does. How does that change the way you view the everyday workers around you, the people we walk past every single day who are quietly forming the true front line of our public safety?